My father forced me out of the family business. Then, he begged me to take it back. Hi, my name is Alma Alera, and I'm 31 years old. I'm a business consultant living in Austin, Texas, and 18 months ago, my father looked me in the eye across the conference table of the company I had spent 8 years building with him, and told me I was fired. Not laid off. Not restructured out. Fired. From the company that had my fingerprints on every single contract, every client relationship, every late night and missed birthday and skipped vacation. He fired me in front of my brother, in front of our CFO, and in front of a woman I had never met before who turned out to be his new business partner. And then he slid a non-disclosure agreement across the table and told me to sign it before I left the building. I didn't sign it. And that decision, that one quiet, trembling act of refusal, started a chain of events that would bring everything he'd built crashing down around him. This is the story of how my family's betrayal became the best thing that ever happened to me, and how my father learned far too late that you should never force out the person who actually holds everything together. My father's name is Gerald Alera. He started Alera Consulting Group in 2001 when I was 7 years old and my brother, Derek, was 5. Growing up, the business was like a third sibling, always present, always demanding attention, always the most important thing in any room. Mom used to joke that Dad was married to Alera Consulting first and to her second. She laughed when she said it, but her eyes never quite matched the smile. Dad was brilliant at sales.
I'll give him that.
He could walk into a room, shake 2 hands, and walk out with a $100,000 contract. What he couldn't do, and what he never wanted to admit, was manage anything after the handshake. Operations, systems, client retention, employee culture. Those things bored him. He wanted the thrill of the deal, and everything that came after felt like maintenance work. That's where I came in. I graduated top of my class from UT Austin with a business degree, and I joined Alera Consulting this summer. I turned 23. Dad was ecstatic. He introduced me to every client like I was a trophy. This is my daughter Alma. She's the smart one. I should have paid more attention to what that phrasing implied about everyone else. Derek, my brother, was 21 at the time and had no interest in the business. He was into music, into his friends, into whatever required the least responsibility. Dad let him float. There was no pressure on Derek, no expectations, no disappointed sighs at dinner. Derek could show up late to a family event and Dad would laugh and say, "That's just Derek." When I missed a family dinner because I was closing a client deal at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, Dad's response was, "Good. That's what it takes." I told myself that was a compliment. I told myself that for 8 years. I restructured the company's entire client management system in my first year. I hired our first dedicated operations manager, built out a proper onboarding process, and increased client retention by 31% in 18 months. Dad celebrated by taking Derek to Vegas for a weekend. I got a handshake and a "good work, kiddo." Still, I loved it. I loved the work, I loved the clients, I loved watching something grow because of decisions I'd made. I put my heart into Alera Consulting as if it had my last name on it, because it did. I thought that meant something. The cracks started showing around year 4. Derek had gone through a rough patch, some failed music venture, a messy breakup, and Dad decided the solution was to bring him into the business. Which was fine, I said. Give him a role, train him, let him find his footing. What I didn't expect was that Dad would give Derek the title of VP of Business Development, a role that had been informally mine, without a single conversation with me about it. I found out from our office manager, Patrice, who assumed I already knew. "Your brother's business cards came in," she said, handing me one cheerfully. "VP of Business Development. That's exciting, right?" I stood there holding that little rectangle of cardstock and felt something shift in my chest. Not crack, just shift. Like a foundation settling. I went to Dad's office. He was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at me and kept talking for 11 more minutes. I counted. When he finally hung up, I placed Derek's business card on his desk and said, "When were you going to tell me?" "Tell you what?" He barely glanced at the card. "Derek needs structure. You know that. The title will give him motivation." "Dad, I've been doing that job for 4 years." You've been doing your job, Alma, which is operations. Derek needs a different lane. His lane is a title I earned. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and said something I have replayed 1,000 times since. Alma, you don't need the title. You have the skill. Derek needs the confidence boost. I walked back to my office, and I did not cry. I made a decision instead. I would document everything. Every system I built, every process I created, every client relationship I cultivated. Not because I planned to leave, but because something in me understood for the first time that I needed to be able to prove what I had built. That documentation would later save me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The next 2 years were a slow erosion. Derek collected his VP title and his salary and showed up when he felt like it, which was maybe 3 days out of 5. When he was there, he was charming and useless in equal measure, great at taking clients to lunch, terrible at anything requiring follow-through. I quietly fixed his mistakes. I covered his gaps. I trained people and then watched him take credit for their results in Dad's presence. And Dad believed it. Or chose to. Then came the introduction of Sandra Voss. Sandra was a business consultant, ironic, given our industry, who had come in theoretically to advise on a potential expansion. Dad introduced her at a company-wide meeting as a strategic partner. She was polished, confident, exactly the type of person Dad was impressed by. I shook her hand, and something in my stomach said, "Pay attention." Over the following 3 months, Sandra was in our office more than some of our full-time employees. She and Dad had lunch meetings I wasn't invited to. She started sitting in on client calls I normally led. When I asked Dad what her role was evolving into, he said, "She's helping us see things with fresh eyes." "Whose eyes exactly?" I asked. He smiled at me in that way that meant the conversation was over. One evening I stayed late, which was normal for me, and walked past the small conference room where Dad and Sandra were working. The door was cracked. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally, but I heard my name and my feet stopped moving. "Alma is too territorial," Sandra was saying. "She's built these systems around herself so that she's irreplaceable. That's actually a liability." "She'd say that's just good business," Dad replied. "It's good business for her. What happens to the company if she leaves? You're dependent on one person. You need distributed knowledge. New leadership. Frankly, Gerald, you need new energy." There was a pause. Then Dad said, "She won't leave on her own." Another pause. Then Sandra said more quietly, "Then you may need to help her make that decision." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. My heart was hammering. Then I walked back to my office, sat down at my desk, and pulled up my documentation folder. I started adding to it immediately. I had no idea how fast things would move after that. 3 weeks later, I was called into the main conference room on a Tuesday morning. Dad was there. Derek was there, which was unusual. He rarely made morning meetings. Sandra was there. And so was our CFO, Robert Hines, who had always been decent to me but had Dad's loyalty first. On the table was a folder. "Sit down, Alma," Dad said. I sat. I looked at Sandra, who was looking at her notepad. I looked at Derek, who was looking at the window. I looked at Dad, who was looking at me like he was stealing himself. "We've made a decision," Dad began, "about the direction of the company. Sandra has come on as a full partner. She's going to be taking over the operations division and leading our expansion strategy. And we think it's time for you to," he paused, "to pursue other opportunities." The room was very quiet. "You're firing me?" I said. "Not a question. We're restructuring." "You're firing me?" I said again. "From the company I have spent 8 years building." "Alma, don't be dramatic. Don't." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Don't use that word with me right now." Sandra pushed the folder toward me. "There's a severance package here that's quite generous, and an NDA. We'd like this transition to be smooth and professional." I looked at the folder. I thought about 8 years. I thought about the hallway outside that conference room 3 weeks ago. I thought about Derek's business card. I thought about every dinner I missed, every weekend I worked, every raise I accepted instead of equity because Dad kept saying, We'll revisit the equity conversation next quarter. For 8 years. I slid the folder back across the table. I'm not signing anything today. Dad's jaw tightened. Alma. I need to have this reviewed by my attorney. Surely that's professional and reasonable. I stood up. Am I allowed to collect my personal items, or will you be having security escort me out? The silence in the room was profound. Take what you need, Dad said finally, quietly. I walked out of that conference room with my spine straight and my hands shaking, and I did not stop walking until I reached my car in the parking garage. And there, alone in the dark between concrete pillars, I allowed myself exactly 4 minutes to fall apart. I set a timer on my phone. When the timer went off, I started making calls. The first call was to my attorney, a woman named Claire Hutchins who I'd worked with on several client contracts over the years. I explained what had happened. She listened carefully, asked sharp questions, and then said something that changed everything. Alma, did your father ever promise you equity in writing? Emails, texts, any documentation? I thought about it. He mentioned it in emails. Multiple times. We'll formalize your equity next quarter. I have years of those. Claire was quiet for a moment. And you built systems, created intellectual property, developed client relationships, all without formal equity compensation, based on those promises? Yes. And you have documentation of what you created and when? Extensive documentation. Another pause. Then, I think you may have a claim here. Not just for severance, for equity interest. The question is how much you want to pursue this, and how far you're willing to go. Tell me everything, I said. Over the next 2 weeks, Claire and I went through everything. My documentation folder, the one I had been building for 2 years out of quiet self-preservation, turned out to be a goldmine. I had time-stamped records of system builds, client acquisition documentation with my direct involvement tracked, internal emails where Dad promised equity and discussed my partnership track, and performance reviews showing that my work had been the operational backbone of the company's 30% growth over 5 years. Claire filed a formal legal claim for breach of implied contract and unjust enrichment. The number we attached to it represented a fair market valuation of my equity interest based on those years of work and the documented promises. The number was significant, but the legal case was only part of what I was building, because during those 2 weeks of documentation review, I found something else, something I hadn't been looking for. In going through old emails, I found a chain between Dad, Derek, and Sandra that had been accidentally copied to a shared administrative folder I still had access to, an oversight in the transition, apparently. The emails were from 6 months prior. They outlined, in fairly explicit detail, a plan to bring Sandra in as a partner, dilute any future equity claim I might have by restructuring the company before formalizing my ownership interest, and then remove me. They had been planning this for 6 months, while I was still working. While I was still building their company. I forwarded that chain to Claire immediately. Oh, she said when she read it. Oh, this is much better. I also called 3 of our top clients, my clients, people I had personally cultivated for years. I was transparent. I'd left the company, I was launching my own consulting practice, and I wanted to let them know. I didn't badmouth Dad or Alara Consulting. I just let them know I was available. All 3 of them asked for my new contact information within the same week. I want to tell you about the morning the legal papers were served to Alara Consulting because I was not there and I heard about it secondhand from Patrice, who texted me 2 words. Gerald screaming. I was sitting in a coffee shop on South Congress, laptop open, new business email set up, Alara Strategic Partners, and I smiled at my coffee cup and kept working. Dad called me 4 times that day. I let every call go to voicemail. That evening, I listened to them in order. The first voicemail was angry. Alma, this is completely unnecessary and vindictive, and I expect you to call Claire off immediately. The second was angrier. You have no idea what kind of damage you're doing. The third voicemail was Derek, not Dad. A first. His voice was quieter. Alma, I know you're upset, but Mom is really stressed. Can you call someone? The fourth voicemail was Dad again. His voice had changed entirely. Lower. careful.
Alma.
Please call me back. There are things we should talk about. I didn't call back.
Not yet.
I had more to do first. The email chain we had found made the legal case substantially more complex for their side. Claire had filed for discovery, which meant Dad's attorneys had to start turning over documents. Within 3 weeks, it became apparent that Sandra's restructuring plan had some problems of its own. Specifically, some of the methods used to preposition the company's equity ahead of my termination raised questions that went beyond our civil case. I also, around this time, quietly reached out to 4 more of the company's mid-tier clients. By the end of month 2, 6 clients representing roughly 40% of Alara Consulting's annual revenue had either moved their contracts to my new firm or were in conversations to do so. I want to be clear. I did not poach them dishonestly. I did not say a word against my father's company. I simply existed and I was available and they chose. That is what happens when the person who actually built the relationships is no longer tied to the brand. I found out later that Sandra had tried to manage those client relationships personally after I left. That she had used a system she didn't fully understand and followed processes she'd only observed from the outside. 3 clients had complained formally within the first month. The 4th voicemail from Dad had been the last of the angry ones. The calls after that were something different entirely. 6 weeks after I was fired, Dad asked to meet me for coffee. I agreed. I chose the location, a small, neutral cafe near my new office, and I arrived 5 minutes early, so I was already seated when he walked in. He looked older. That surprised me. I don't know why it surprised me, but it did. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping, and he was wearing a jacket I recognized from years ago that seemed a little too big for him now. He sat down across from me. He ordered coffee he didn't touch.
You look well, he said.
I am well, I said. A silence. He wrapped his hands around his mug. The lawsuit is proceeding, I said. Talk to Claire if you have questions about the lawsuit. Alma. Dad. He looked at me for a long moment. Sandra made some recommendations that I should have questioned more carefully. Yes, I said. She did. The clients made their own decisions. 40%, Alma. That's a number Claire can also discuss with you. He exhaled slowly. I didn't think. I underestimated how much of it was you. Personally, I thought the systems would run themselves. Sandra said. I know what Sandra said. I told him quietly. I was in the hallway. He went very still. 3 weeks before you fired me, I said. The conference room door cracked. She won't leave on her own. Remember? His face did something complicated and painful to watch. Alma, I don't need an apology right now, Dad. My voice was steady. I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head so many times, but now that I was here, I found I didn't need the script. I just needed the truth. I need you to understand what actually happened. You had something extraordinary, and you couldn't see it because it had always been there. I was the wallpaper, the furniture, the thing that made the room work without anyone noticing it working. He didn't say anything. I loved that company, I said. I loved what we built. And you let someone who had known you for 3 months convince you to throw out someone who had given you 8 years. I paused. I need you to sit with that, Dad. Not for me, for yourself. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, in a voice I'd never heard from him before, small, careful, genuinely uncertain. I want to make this right. Whatever it takes. The settlement, the equity, whatever Claire asks for. And I want to know if there's any world in which. He stopped. Started again. The company is in trouble, Alma. Real trouble. Sandra is. There are issues with Sandra that I'm only now beginning to understand. And I don't know if I can fix this without you. I looked at my father. This man who had called me the smart one like it was a consolation prize. Who had given my brother my title to boost his confidence. Who had sat across a conference table and slid an NDA toward me like I was a liability to be managed. I looked at him, and I felt something that surprised me. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Not the clean, bright rush of revenge I had imagined during those first terrible weeks. I felt tired. And clear. And free. I'm not coming back to Alara Consulting, I said. My firm is growing. I have clients I'm responsible to and a business I'm proud of. That chapter is over. Alma. But I held up one hand. The legal process will run its course. Claire will negotiate a fair settlement based on what I'm actually owed. And if, once that's resolved, you want to explore whether there's any future consulting relationship between your company and mine, a professional one, at fair market rate, with everything in writing, I'm willing to have that conversation. I paused. A professional conversation, not a family favor.
He nodded slowly.
His eyes were wet, which I had not expected, and which I refused to let derail me. I should have seen you, he said. I should have seen what you were doing. I'm sorry. I picked my bag. Start with the settlement, I said. We can figure out the rest later. And I walked out into the Austin sunshine, and the day was warm, and my phone had 2 new client inquiry emails waiting, and I felt for the first time in a very long time, exactly like myself. The settlement was finalized 4 months later. It was fair, more than fair, honestly, a number that reflected what 8 years of foundational work was actually worth. Sandra Voss quietly departed from Alara Consulting 2 months before that, under circumstances Dad never fully explained and I never asked about, though I heard through the industry grapevine that her departure involved some financial discrepancies that were handled privately. Alara Consulting still exists. It's smaller now, humbler. Dad brought in a proper operations director and eventually did reach out about a limited consulting engagement through my firm. We have worked together twice, professionally, with contracts and scope of work documents and invoices like any other business relationship. It is strange and manageable and honest in a way that our family relationship never quite was. Derek actually called me about a year after everything, not for the business, but just to apologize. Quietly, awkwardly, like he was out of practice, with sincerity. He said he knew what he'd let happen, the credit-taking, the title, the standing there in that conference room, without saying a word. I appreciated the call. We are not close, but we are not enemies, and that feels like enough. My firm, Alara Strategic Partners, hit 7 figures in revenue in its first full operating year. I have a team of 6 people I respect enormously, clients who feel genuinely partnered with us, and work that challenges me every single day. I live in a house with good light and a back porch where I have coffee every morning without checking my phone for 15 minutes first. That 15 minutes of quiet is the luxury I am proudest of. I don't tell this story because I think my father is a monster. He isn't. He's a person who made choices that prioritized comfort and flattery over loyalty and truth, and who paid a real price for those choices. I tell this story because for 8 years, I let someone else's perception of my value define what I believed I deserved. I was the smart one, as if that was a category separate from worthy, separate from seen, separate from enough. If you are building something and you feel invisible inside it, document what you're doing. Know what you're worth. Make sure your contribution lives somewhere outside the story someone else tells about it. And if someone forces you out of the thing you built,
Don't beg to stay.
Go build something better. That's what I did. And I would not change a single step of it.